Welcome to this episode. In recent weeks, there's been an absolutely huge controversy regarding the race of the ancient Egyptians, fueled by the recent release of the movie Cleopatra on Netflix. Cleopatra lived around 35 BC, roughly 2,500 years after the last pyramids were built. She was there when Egyptian civilization had already collapsed under foreign invasions, in her own case, by the Romans. The pyramid and temples were already ancient relics when Cleopatra was born. For all we know, she might as well be Greek or Roman, because Egypt was under foreign rule anyway, and had been for 250 years or so up till Cleopatra's birth. So from a point of strictly African history, Cleopatra is relatively unimportant. The constant Hollywood fixation on this personality, who lived long after Egypt had been overrun by foreigners, remains a mystery to us here at the African History Station. Here, we focus primarily on dynastic Egypt prior to the Greek, Roman, and Arab invasions of Africa. The Egypt of the pyramids, temple building pharaohs. The Egypt that Greek philosophers and scholars like Aristotle, Homer, Herodotus, Diodorus of Sicily visited and knew about. The Egypt of 5000 BC to 200 BC or thereabouts. So, what did these legendary, highly respected ancient Greek scholars, historians, and philosophers who hold an almost godlike status in today's academia have to say about the race of the ancient Egyptians? We start with possibly the most famous and revered of them all, Aristotle. Aristotle was a Greek philosopher, scientist, and tutor to Alexander, who was born in 384 BC. Aristotle is said to have written 150 philosophical treatises. Aristotle studied and made significant contributions to logic, metaphysics, mathematics, physics, biology, botany, ethics, politics, agriculture, medicine, dance, and theatre, according to Justin Humphreys, who wrote about Aristotle. Aristotle wrote in his work Physiognomics that too black a hue marks the coward as witness Egyptians and Ethiopians, and so does also too white a complexion, as you may see from women. The complexion of courage is between the two. Aristotle also made reference to the hair form of Egyptians and Ethiopians. Of course, Ethiopians was the name the Greeks called all Africans south of Egypt, those we call sub-Saharan Africans today. Aristotle wrote, "Why are the Ethiopians and Egyptians bandy-legged? Is it because the bodies of living creatures become distorted by heat, like logs of wood when they become dry? The condition of their hair supports this theory, for it is curlier than that of other nations, and curliness is, as it were, crookedness of the hair." Lucian of Samosata, the Greek writer, lived around 125 BC. Lucian's works were widely popular in antiquity, and more than 80 writings attributed to him have survived to the present day, a considerably higher quantity than for most other classical Greek writers. In his book Navigations, Lucian introduces two Greeks, Licinius and Timoleus, who start a conversation. Licinius, describing a young Egyptian, says, "This boy is not merely black. He has thick lips and his legs are too thin. His hair, worn in a plait behind, shows that he's not a free man." Timoleus, "But that is a sign of really distinguished birth in Egypt, Licinius. All freeborn children plait their hair until they reach manhood. It is the exact opposite of the custom of our ancestors, who thought it seemly for old men to secure their hair with a gold brooch to keep it in place." Apollodorus of Athens was born in 180 BC. He was a Greek scholar, historian, poet, and philosopher. He was a pupil of the notable ancient Greek philosopher Diogenes of Babylon. According to a BBC World Report article titled "The Story of Africa, Nile Valley," which is widely available online, Apollodorus in his writings described Egypt as the country of the black-footed ones. Ammianus Marcellinus was a Roman soldier and historian who wrote a major historical account, Res Gestae, which chronicled the history of Rome from 96 AD to 378 AD. Ammianus served as a military officer in the army of the Emperor Constantius II and Julian, so he was the kind of person whom you would more or less trust to tell you accurately what the people of a particular country or region looked like. He was born as late as 330 AD, when Egypt was under Roman rule and had suffered centuries of foreign rule, and yet he still wrote that the men of Egypt are mostly brown and black, with a skinny, desiccated look. Galen was born in 129 AD and was a Greek physician, writer, and philosopher who exercised a huge influence on medical theory and practice in Europe from the Middle Ages until the mid-17th century. When Galen was 16, he started a career in medicine, which he studied first at Pergamum in modern-day Turkey and finally in Egypt, which was the greatest medical center of the ancient world. He spent a full decade in Egypt. When he later went to settle in Rome, he wrote in his book, Mixtures, that the hair of Egyptians, and in general all peoples who inhabit hot, dry places, has poor growth and is black, dry, curly, and brittle. Herodotus was a Greek historian and geographer born in 484 BC and is known to Western historians today as the father of history. He is known especially for having written the Histories, a detailed account of the Greco-Persian Wars. Herodotus was the first Greek writer to perform systematic investigation of historical events. He is referred to as the father of history, a title conferred on him by the ancient Roman orator Cicero. Herodotus' eyewitness accounts indicate that he travelled in Egypt together with some fellow Greeks around 454 BC. Herodotus wrote, based on what he saw there, that the Egyptians have burnt skin, flat noses, thick lips, and woolly hair. Herodotus also wrote in his book Histories, the names of nearly all the gods came to Greece from Egypt, for the names of all the gods have been known in Egypt from the beginning of time. It was the Egyptians too who originated and taught the Greeks ceremonial meeting, processions, and liturgies. The Egyptians were also the first to assign each month and each day to a particular deity, and to foretell the date of a man's birth, his character, his fortunes. The Egyptians too have made more use of omens and prognostics than any other nation. He continued, referring to the Colchians of the Black Sea in Europe. There can be no doubt that the Colchians are an Egyptian race. My own conjectures were founded first on the fact that they are black-skinned and have woolly hair, which certainly amounts to but little, since several other nations are so too, but further and more especially on the circumstance that the Colchians, the Egyptians, and the Ethiopians are the only nations who have practiced circumcision from the earliest times. Diodorus of Sicily lived in the 1st century BC and was a Greek historian known for writing the monumental universal history called Bibliotheca Historica, or the Library of History, in 40 books, 15 of which still survive intact. He wrote this work between 60 BC and 30 BC. Luckily for us, his reports about Africa were among the surviving writings. Diodorus devoted an entire chapter of Bibliotheca Historica to the Cushites, or the Ethiopians of Meroe. Here, he repeats the story of their great piety and adds the fascinating legend that they were the founders of Egyptian civilization, invented writing, and had given the Egyptians their religion and culture. They further write that it was among them that people were first taught to honor the gods and offer sacrifices and arrange processions and festivals and perform other things by which people honor the divine. For this reason, their piety is famous among all men, and the sacrifices among the Ethiopians are believed to be particularly pleasing to the divinity. The Ethiopians say that the Egyptians are settlers from among themselves, and that Osiris was the leader of the settlement. The customs of the Egyptians, they say, are for the most part Ethiopian, the settlers having preserved their old traditions. For to consider the king's gods, to pay great attention to funeral rites, and many other things are Ethiopian practices, and also the style of their statues and the form of their writing are Ethiopian. Also, the way the priestly colleges are organized is said to be the same in both nations, for all who have to do with the cult of the gods they maintain are ritually pure. The priests are shaved in the same way. They have the same robes and the type of scepter shaped like a plough, which also the kings have, who use tall pointed felt hats ending in a knob, with the snakes that they call the aspis coiled around them. There are also numerous other Ethiopian tribes. Some live along both sides of the River Nile and on the islands in the river. Others dwell in the regions that border on Arabia. Others again have settled in the interior of Libya. The majority of these tribes, in particular those who live along the river, have black skin, snub-nosed faces, and curly hair. The opinion of the ancient Greek writers on the Egyptians is more or less summed up by French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero when he writes, by the almost unanimous testimony of ancient historians, the Egyptians belong to an African race which first settled in Ethiopia on the Middle Nile. Following the course of the river, they gradually reached the sea. In his book Egypt, British scholar Sir E.A. Wallace Budge says, the prehistoric native of Egypt was African, and there's every reason for saying that the earliest settlers came from the south. There are many things in the manners and customs and religions of the historic Egyptians that suggests that the original home of their prehistoric ancestors was in a country in the neighborhood of Uganda and Punt, that's Somalia. The French writer Constantin Francois Volney, in his important work, The Ruins of Empires, extends this point of view by saying that the Egyptians were the first people to attain the physical and moral sciences necessary to civilized life. In referring to the basis of this achievement, he states further that it was then on the borders of the Upper Nile, among a black race of men, that was organized a complicated system of worship of the stars, considered in relation to the productions of the earth and the labors of agriculture. And this first worship, characterized by their adoration under their own forms and national attributes, was a simple proceeding of the human mind. Stephanus of Byzantium, who was said to represent the opinions of the most ancient Greeks, was a Byzantine grammarian and the author of an important geographical dictionary called Ethnica, in which he said regarding all of Africa south of Egypt, which the Greeks called Ethiopia, that Ethiopia was the first established country on earth, and the Ethiopians were the first to set up the worship of the gods and to establish laws. The later ages gained from this ancient empire the fundamental principles upon which republican governments are founded. The basic stones of that wonderful dominion were equality, temperance, industry, intelligence, and justice. Flora Shaw was an English historian who worked as a foreign correspondent for the Times newspaper of London and who was married to Lord Lugard, the Governor-General of colonial Nigeria between 1914 and 1919. In 1906, Flora Shaw wrote a book titled A Tropical Dependency. It was an extraordinary exploration of the history of Africa, which she gathered from countless sources, and one would imagine a great deal of it came from the British Library and from the archives of the Times of London. She was known to be an intensive researcher into her subject matter, and one can only wonder at the number of years she put into this undertaking, which became the reference work for so many future books on Africa. This book was first published over 100 years ago, showing with detail and descriptive power the greatness that Africa once was. Lady Lugard argues in the book that when the history of Negroland comes to be written in detail, it may be found that the kingdoms lying towards the eastern end of Sudan, classical home of ancient Ethiopians, were the home of races who inspired rather than of races who received the tradition of civilization associated for us with the name of ancient Egypt. For they cover on either side of the Upper Nile, between the latitudes of 10 degrees and 7 degrees, territories in which are found monuments more ancient than the oldest Egyptian monuments. If this should prove to be the case and civilized world be forced to recognize in a black people the fount of its original enlightenment, it may happen that we shall have to revise entirely our view of the black races and regard those who now exist as the decadent representatives of an almost forgotten era, rather than as the embryonic possibility of an era yet to come. English traveller Thomas Lee, a member of the British Parliament, visited Egypt and Nubia in 1812 and was one of the first Europeans to visit the archaeological sites above the First Cataract and to publish plates of ruins that no longer exist today. Lee wrote that there has been considerable dispute about the colour of the ancient Egyptians. Some authors asserted that they were Negroes, while others maintained that the present Copts are their descendants, and attempt to prove their supposition by the appearance of mummies which exhibit complexions of dusky browns, lips occasionally thick, but the nose frequently aquiline. The opinion that the former inhabitants of the country were Negroes is founded chiefly on the expressions used by Herodotus, who calls them dark-coloured and woolly haired, and on the character of the head of the Sphinx, which has the Negro features and may be justly supposed to offer a correct representation of the countenance of the Egyptians. Count Volney, the French scholar, world traveller, aristocrat and confidant of Benjamin Franklin, wondered that a people now forgotten discovered while others were yet barbarians the elements of the arts and the sciences, a race of men now rejected from society for their sable skin and frizzled hair, founded on the study of the laws of nature, those civil and religious systems would still govern the universe. On this point, the Count had not the slightest doubt. The Greeks had unanimously proclaimed Egypt's African origins, and the stony evidence of the Sphinx, whose features were clearly etched in the African mold, confirmed it. Wasn't it a cruel irony of history that the very people who had given the world civilization were now a race of slaves and outcasts, he wondered. And when we know what we now know, that Egypt was a black African civilization as confirmed by illustrious, credible, ancient Greek eyewitnesses, whatever Cleopatra's skin color was or wasn't becomes truly irrelevant, not least because she's associated with invaders of Egypt in a colonized Egypt at the very tail end of the civilization around 40 BC, long after the great pharaohs and queens of the empire had lived, and thousands of years after the pyramids and temples were built. So no disrespect to Queen Cleopatra, but we just do not see what the great fuss over her is all about, and why Hollywood is always churning out movies about this person. If someone knows, please leave a comment below, because like they say, we learn something new every day. Thanks for watching this episode. Remember to like, comment and subscribe, and look out for the next one on Africa's great civilizations.